It's my honor to introduce the moderator for this morning's plenary session, entitled The Whole Child, From Cradle to Career, a generational opportunity to lift California's most impoverished children and families. Kris Connealy is the senior reporter for early childhood at KPCC, Southern California Public Radio. She covers issues facing children 0 to 5 and those who care for them, and the policies and research that shape early childhood. So without further ado, it's our great pleasure, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Kris Connealy and her panel.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here. So yes, my name is Kris Connealy. I'm usually on the radio, but this is my face. So here I am. So we're gonna have a great conversation about these proposals relating to education and covering early childhood. I'm often paying attention to things going on in Sacramento in terms of legislation, and when the budget proposal comes out, I'll have my eye on it. But this year, there has been more going on really than ever from talking to so many people in the field. So there's a lot to discuss here, and we have a great panel. First, we have Giannia Perez, the Senior Policy Advisor for Early Childhood in the Office of Governor Gavin Newsom, Kim Patillo-Brownson, Vice President of Policy and Strategy at First 5 LA, and Chris Haney, Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. So thank you all so much for being here. So there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the proposals around early childhood and higher education. But first, before we kind of dig into that, I want to just set the foundation for how each of you fit into this world. So Giannia, you are the Senior Policy Advisor for Early Childhood in the Governor's Office, and so it's been a few months now. Tell us, what do you actually do, and how unusual is your role within the administration?
Sure. Good morning, buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited, not only because it has been just a few months, but that this governor has made it crystal clear that early childhood is here. It's not a one-year issue. He has made the commitment that this is going to be one of his policy priorities. I'm also excited because he's also said the North Star, one of the many North Stars, is eliminating child poverty. So with that, what does that mean for me as I show up every day to work? It means that I, at this point right now, have some serious pom-poms going on for the governor's budget, because we first and foremost need to pass this year's budget. Why do we need to pass it? Because it's a multi-billion-dollar investment in children, but what I really appreciate this governor's vision is that it's not just about the child. It is a whole child comprehensive view, looking at both health and education, but it's also a look at families view. It's a whole family, and what I like to say is it's really ultimately about whole communities. How are we transforming our state as a whole to really do much better for kids and families? So 2 generations is there, economic supports, it's all there. And my day-to-day job is right at this point to cheerlead the hell out of that.
And you're really part of kind of a little ECE army within the administration, so I assume you're having...
Or a cheer squad is another way to look at it.
Yeah, cheer squad, I like that. So I assume that you're having, or will be having, a lot of conversations with people like Chris Perry and Health and Human Services, and just all throughout the administration.
Thank you for teeing that up. So the governor has made an investment staff-wise on early childhood as well. So for the first time ever, the governor has somebody who's his policy advisor on all things early childhood in the horseshoe, and that's a big deal for many folks who work in Sacramento to say, oh, where do you work? In the governor's office. Yeah, but where do you work? In the governor's office in the horseshoe. And so they're like, oh, okay, wow. And then in addition to my role, we have someone whose sole purpose is at Health and Human Services to focus on the implementation of early childhood initiatives. So this governor believes in making investments that also, as we know, it doesn't stop there. You pass the budget, but you need to make sure that these investments are doing right by kids and by families. So we have Chris Perry, who many of you know as a national figure with the Ounce Prevention Fund, formerly with First Five as well, so she's leading that helm. And in addition to that, we have other folks with our rockstar Surgeon General, who's taken a very strong role in early childhood with ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, trauma. So we consider her part of the team. In addition to, of course, I'd be remiss to say the governor himself is part of this team, and Ann O'Leary, who is a very big stalwart for early childhood, who is his chief of staff. And then we have other senior policy advisors. I don't know if folks are interested in that, but the governor has said we want other folks whose primary focus is on key core issues. So we have somebody who's actually with the governor right now in El Salvador on immigration. That is her key issue. We have somebody dedicated to higher education, somebody focused on cradle to career, somebody focused on speaking about energy. There's a huge energy issue going right now too, and we have somebody whose key focus is on energy and climate. And very soon we'll have other folks who really will make some great connections with the work that you are doing as well.
Great, so much going on. Kim, I am usually talking to you about things going on at First 5 LA and your policy lens, but you also got an appointment recently to the Board of Education. So talk about that. Congratulations. And yeah, talk a little bit about why it's significant to have an early childhood person in that position.
So the State Board of Does that work? Yeah. All right. So the State Board of Education is such an exciting honor, and it is also, I think, in many ways, a reflection of the governor's understanding of how systems need to work together for children and families in ways that there hasn't been that much attention to in the past. The K-12 system currently serves about 70% of our 4-year-olds already. So local educational agencies, school districts, county office of ed, already provide the vast majority of preschool services for 4-year-olds across the state. They also provide a healthy amount of services and early learning opportunities for 3-year-olds, and yet there has not been historically much articulation between the early childhood system and the K-12 system. And the State Board of Education, the mantra of which is normally to the 6 million K-12 students served through local educational agencies. In addition, there's 3.2 million 0 to 5-year-olds across California, most of which are touched by our school district partners. So what's really exciting is it's a moment and an opportunity to think about how these systems can actually align to make sure that they do what families need them to do, right? Which is to actually educate children, especially low-income children who we know start kindergarten disproportionately behind the 8 ball. And we want to make sure that those kids start ready to go just as much as every other kid in California. So it's an exciting, I think, gesture on the part of the governor to actually think about aligning these systems. To my knowledge, I don't think there's been an early childhood advocate appointed to the state board before, so I'm really honored to wave that flag. And I also think it's a nod to some work around public accountability. Los Angeles, and this is a sort of a funny thing to say to this crowd, so many of us here at SCG have heard about the A through G campaign and LAUSD's multiple campaigns around equity and sort of public transparency in budgeting. But I can also say that from my prior work when I was at Advancement Project, what's fascinating to realize is that it hasn't necessarily rolled out that way for the rest of the state. LAUSD was one of the first school districts to commit significant resources, for example, to foster youth, to interventions needed to make sure that foster youth got a guidance counselor, a mental health counselor, that there was trauma-informed instruction as part of professional development for K-12 teachers. And at the same time, when I was still at Advancement Project, we were providing technical assistance to a couple of school districts, which I shall not name. And one of the very first investments that was proposed in one of these other school districts was not dedicated resources for foster youth, but was drug-sniffing police dogs for a local elementary school. And so when we think about both the early childhood side of sort of knitting systems together, there's also some system building that needs to happen at the local level that the state board, I think, could play a really robust role in helping local communities actually have a voice at the table, say what needs to happen. And if you're an elementary school parent, I'm pretty confident you don't want a drug-sniffing police dog.
Well, a lot to keep our eyes on there, so we'll be paying attention to the role that you'll have there. And for Kris, I'm wondering, how is this moment different for you in your position at the California Budget and Policy Center? What are, there's all of this action and excitement that we're talking about. How is it playing out in your role?
Well, one of the things that's just fundamentally different and something we're all trying to figure out as we figure out the Newsom administration and how to make some of these great proposals go forward is that the dynamic is just completely flipped. For the last 8 years, which were a successful run, I'm not critiquing Governor Brown, but just the styles are so different. For the last 8 years, or at least 6 of the last 8 years, as we came out of a Great Recession, the style was Governor Brown kind of lowballed the revenue estimates, kind of kept the policy proposals pretty reserved, and then advocates worked with the legislature to try to push some of the proposals up a notch. And they'd get a few wins each year, and we'd kind of roll forward and try again the next year. Governor Newsom just came out swinging, right? Or sprinting, or whatever you want to say, and has a whole range of very broad proposals that are connected to each other in terms of the intersectionality across early childhood and health and housing, affordability issues generally, things like ending child poverty. And now we're trying to figure out, and in some ways, now the reticence is at the legislative level, where they're kind of saying like, whoa, hey, like that's a lot, right? Maybe we should slow down a little bit. And for the advocates and the folks who are working in Sacramento, it's completely different, trying to figure out like, okay, are we on the governor's side on this one? Because that's not, we've been kind of working against the governor the last few years, and everybody's figuring it out. So I would say that's just one thing that's changed a lot. I think the second thing that's really changed is really trying to get a handle on the intersectionality that's happening here. So we have, a lot of times what you have are very robust advocacy communities that are in particular silos, right? Early childhood development and education, healthcare, housing, criminal justice reform, poverty reduction and the safety net, and trying to understand that across a whole range of these proposals you have a sort of consistency of approach, right? To try to sort of say like, look, let's make sure we're doing something to support children, but we're doing it in the higher education system. So there are higher education proposals to increase grants for people who are trying to go to school and have kids, right? Or who are non-traditional students. And you have higher education proposals that have things like supporting more funding for supporting immigrant services and the like. And you have health proposals in the early childhood world, right, around developmental screenings and trauma screenings, and sort of understanding the connection of those things and making sure that those of us who operate in those silos are working together to sort of try to make some progress is the other thing. The last thing I would just say about that is different that was also we have to understand about the budget is there's really 3 different things going on in the governor's proposals in terms of strategy. There are one-time investments. We're at a kind of peak period perhaps in the state's budget. Revenues are coming in at a pretty good clip, but you never know how long the economy stays in a period of growth. So the governor is smartly, I think, including a whole bunch of one-time investments in things like the underlying infrastructure of systems, like childcare infrastructure and training, preschool infrastructure, so that if we are able to expand slots in those systems going forward, the underlying infrastructure is in place to do that. But he's also got some ongoing investments, things like 10,000 new preschool slots. And then he's got things that are plans for the next several years. So even though we have to pass a budget, as Jeannie has said, there are also these things that set the stage for the next several years, like a very significant expansion of paid family leave, which isn't, the whole details have not been mapped out. A commission's going to be formed or a task force is going to be formed, but trying to move paid family leave to 6 months instead of 12 weeks and figuring out how to do that over the next several years. Another example of that is that even though there are 10,000 slots in this year's budget proposed for the preschool system, the governor has signaled that he wants 200,000 more slots in that system and a move toward universal full-day full-year pre-K for all 4-year-olds in the state. So even though that's not a this-year budget item, that is a sort of future-year budget item, and that's happening all at the same time, too.
So you started going through some of the the kind of line items that are exciting or of note in the early childhood and higher education, but can you walk us through some of the others?
Sure, there's a lot. I'll
Yeah.
try to do it
Yeah.
quickly. So in the early childhood development world generally, there's a whole array of proposals. The biggest ones are that there's $750 million for underlying preschool facilities investments. And then there's these 10,000 additional slots in the pre-K system. In the subsidized childcare world, there are about $500 million in investments in childcare infrastructure. This is for facilities, but it's also for workforce training and development for people who would go into that system. And then there's a series of supporting pieces, like this paid family leave expansion is included in the budget. There's a one-time, first-time state investment in child savings accounts of $50 million. There's expanded funding for home visiting programs and for Black infant health programs. And then there's these early developmental screenings and trauma screenings that Giannina mentioned earlier. So there's a whole array of things in that world. And in the higher education arena, the most significant elements are probably in the community college world. We've had a tuition-free 1-year program in place called the College Promise Program, and the governor is proposing to expand that to a second year of free community college, tuition-free community college. That's probably the most significant expansion going forward there. But there's a whole other series of increased funding for CSU and UC, and there's a series of supports for immigrant services and families and the like across those. Last thing I would just say there is, this is going to sound really nerdy, but it's really important to the future of the state's ability to do cradle to career well, is there's an investment or there's a proposed investment in creating a longitudinal data system to track children from and how they perform and how they do from that early childhood range up to that higher education range or era. And there are a number of other states that have done this, and the ability to do this really sort of tells us what works in public policy, how we can do it better, and the state has been behind the times in some respects in not having that kind of a data system. So hopefully that's something we'll get in place as well.
Yeah, Giannina, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of those proposals around early childhood? Or the things that you think that people in this room should particularly be paying attention to?
Yes, I think just to piggyback about the data being a nerdy thing, I think this governor has made it quite clear that data, yes, it's a 4-letter word, but it's not that kind of 4-letter word. We are going to be using it over and over again. We're not going to be afraid of it. We're going to look at disparities. We're going to look at equity. We're going to not, we're just going to have these harder conversations about what's going on. When you look at early childhood, 75% of kids are kids of color. And yet, we don't have a lot of data about what's going on. Even within, for example, Latino populations, we're going to have to dig down even more because Latino kids there's a lot of Latino kids now, so we need to know more. What's going on with linguistically isolated families? What's going on in second generation and third generation? There's a lot of rich data that I think we need to just be smarter about and have these conversations. So that was my plug for data because I think we're all becoming data enthusiasts, I won't say nerd, enthusiasts about this conversation. I think the other piece is just to point out that I know the governor's also committed to is the economic supports for families, so the safety net. So this governor has put investments in increasing CalWORKs so that we are eliminating deep poverty in CalWORKs. That's something that we should all, be proud of. And of course, he's saying that's not enough. But I think he's signaling once again, it's about we know there's so much economic insecurity and stress and how it impacts children physically when there's those kinds of traumas happening in their lives. So he's put an investment in the safety net. He's also said earned income tax credit, I'm going to double down on that. We're going to make it $1 billion program. We're going to increase the amount that families can qualify for it. And once again, back to early childhood, we're going to add an additional $500 for families who have children 5 and younger, because he's trying to make that connection again. Early childhood, some of the most important critical periods that we can make in a children's and family's life, so let's make investments there. So those are some of the pieces that I really appreciate, the buckets of direct services that are of high quality, but also economic supports for families right now because we know there's so much going on, and then looking to the future, supporting them when they're going back to higher education. So I really appreciate that through line that he's doing, and that he really wants to do more as well. He's said, like, this is a down payment, which I find terribly exciting.
Kim, since there is so much here, are there any other areas that you want to highlight?
Maybe I'll actually just sort of pull the lens back a little bit more and offer an interpretive lens on what is common among many of these budget line items, because it's pretty incredible how much is in there, actually. But when I think about what are the themes that sort of unite the various strands of the budget, there's a very real recognition and a new recognition that children and families don't live in silos, right? That the cumulative haul and cumulative set of challenges that families in poverty in particularly are facing are not singular. It's not just that a child needs preschool. It's not just that they need a developmental screen. It's not that they just need a little bit of extra funding through CalWORKs. It's that if we are serious about actually getting to deep poverty, we have to do all of those in unison. And that is very new, very exciting, and is pretty much unprecedented. And to your earlier point, I think it is actually challenging our friends in the legislature, our friends within government itself, and the advocacy community to sort of get out of our single subject area silos and actually think about what it means to be interdisciplinary and meet families where they are. I also think there's a huge piece that is new, which is that the governor is talking about children and families issues as justice issues. That is not even necessarily part of our parlance here, right? Oftentimes, children's issues are described as charity issues for sort of a Christmas time, Bob Cratchit imagination of Tiny Tim and what children need, as opposed to thinking about what are the systems that reproduce inequality, disadvantage, that basically calcify disadvantage. And these are much more deep-reaching than handouts. These are actually about two-generation policies. When you think about, for example, the Cal Grants, it is recognizing that if you are a CSU student and you are also a family and a parent, you need something to feed your child. And that should not be a shock to anyone who's ever had to go to school or feed a child. These are not rocket science things, but they are absolutely new in our government. The last thing I'll just say is that I think the focus on lifting up what has been small and beautiful is particularly a challenge to all of us here in LA, but also within the philanthropic community. There are several things that I think of and claim proudly as an Angelino as homegrown innovations. For example, there's a big focus on developmental screenings for young children. There's a big focus on Cal EITC, but that did not originate in LA. But I will certainly say that, I don't know if Joe Sandberg is here, there has been a big push within philanthropy to actually push and think about what Cal EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, could do for not just LA, but for the whole state. And so as the folks in this room in particular have been dabbling in innovation and making things small and beautiful, this is a moment to think about making it large and transformative. And that is a really, I think, exciting opportunity.
Yeah, there's just trying to track, and we're only talking about the early childhood. Yes. Some of higher ed, but only those aspects of the budget there's so much there. When I was in Sacramento a couple of weeks ago, I went to Kris Perry's office, and she has this sketch on her whiteboard that's like, broken down by age group, 0 to 6 months, and all the different funding streams that she's drawn for herself just to keep track of it all. So there really is so much there. As we mentioned before, a lot of these things that we're seeing are one-time investments, and Kris, you talked a little bit about the strategy behind that. But in looking to make more long-term investments, how do you shift that strategy so that these are sustainable?
So I think I get this question a lot from advocates, and as a former advocate, or I still I have to remember I am an advocate in many ways, but I am also working in the governor's office. I think that the question is something that we should be asking, but at the same time, the governor's made it clear that budget resiliency and budget prudency is going to be another mainstay of his tenure. He does not want to go back, and I, as an advocate, and I can't imagine how many families dealt with this, but $1 billion was cut just in childcare and preschool during the last recession. We don't want to do that again. Bottom line. We don't want to set families up thinking this is what's going to be there and then not be able to deliver. So I think there's this tension of absolutely we want to look at what are additional revenue sources, what are streamlining, what are administrative efficiencies, where does philanthropy, where does the business community, where do individuals who can afford it, what is everyone's role into making this happen? But I think the question about ongoing sustainability is something that we all need to just answer in the larger frame, because Department of Finance, who is very much a partner in this, which I think is something as an advocate before, that wasn't the way I also viewed it, but because of the governor's tone, they are also looking at ways to get smarter about how we fund things. They've made it clear the recession is coming now, very soon, and so we have to be prepared for it. So it's just the tension of we want to keep going, he will keep going, but I think a number of these pieces do need to be one time. And as every budget every year technically is one time. I mean, there is not a guarantee that things will constantly be funded. So I want to also offer that up, that I don't think it's going to be like a gotcha. Oh, one time, okay, there, that's it, we're done. I think the governor gets that this is an ongoing conversation.
What do you think needs to shift so that, in those opening remarks, we heard about how the energy crisis kind of swept away all of the momentum that had been there at one point. Whatever the crisis that may come in the future, how do you keep these issues around education somewhere near the top of the priority list?
So what I take solace in is that it has been an energy crisis that happened right in the governor's first couple of months, but many folks may have not been following that as much. But PG&E went bankrupt. And there were folks in my office who were like, oh my God, what if the lights go out everywhere? Like that's their bread and butter of thinking that through. And yet, because this governor has staffed up in such a way that he have others of us who are focused on other pieces of the budget pie. So I am very proud that this governor is able to handle and juggle a lot of different pieces because he's put staff in place. He's also put some amazing folks in agency who really are committed to these holistic, comprehensive, robust services as well. So while he is handling a lot of the day-to-day crises, immigration right now, he is in another country, the first time ever, going to talk about issues that have an impact in California. So I guess I said, we got this, but no, he really is trying to make that commitment of juggling it all and trying to move all the pieces, even though crises are happening right now.
And there's all of this action happening in the governor's office, but there's also many efforts in other parts of the state. And, Kris, you talked about some of the efforts in the legislature, and later this month, the Blue Ribbon Commission on Early Childhood Education will be coming out with their recommendations after years of work there. How do you see all of these different pieces going on in the state working together?
Well, I think they're, right now, on paper, they should be working together great, right? So my staff have been advising the Blue Ribbon Commission over the last couple of years, and the kinds of proposals and conversations that have been happening there are exactly the kinds of things that are in the governor's proposals. I mean, not everything might not be 100% aligned, but the expansion of the slots, the investments in facilities, all of the other supporting elements, those are all in those conversations. And those are also things that folks in the legislature have wanted to do. So on paper, it's all really well aligned, right? The function of the process now is figuring out how to make sure everybody sort of reaches an agreement to make some advances in the course of this first budget cycle. And some of it's about politics, right? Part of what's the challenge of coming out sprinting when you're a governor is you sort of suck all the wind out of the sails, and everybody else is wondering whether they're going to get wins along the way. And some of this is about the governor kind of leaving some space for there to be some wins in the legislature. So some of those folks who who have been champions for these issues can see that that they're getting something out of this politically as well, to just be somewhat crass about it. But I think that in the end, that'll get worked out, right? This is all a set of folks who kind of mostly want to get these things done, and then the only real constraint is really sort of what's fiscally feasible and how to sustain that going forward in terms of a potential recession. The one thing I would say there is the state is in much better fiscal position for a potential recession than we were last time around. The Legislative Analyst Office has estimated what would happen if the state were to encounter a small to medium-sized recession. And between the rainy day fund buildup, which Governor Newsom is also prioritizing, the fact that the state has paid down debts, is continuing to pay down its pension and health care liabilities, which is another major area that's in the governor's budget, means that there is more space to weather that kind of a recession, which might mean that we would delay some of the bigger investments because you just have to ride out a potential recession. But it hopefully means that we're not in a place where we're cutting $1 billion out of these core systems going forward.
In a few minutes, we'll be opening it up to your questions, so get those ready in your mind. But we've been talking a lot about the excitement, and this is for any of you who want to jump in on this. Are there areas where there is more excitement and where there's more pushback in some of these proposals? Kris?
Well, one area is that there's certainly folks in the subsidized childcare arena that would like to have seen a continued expansion of the number of slots in the system. So over the last 5 or 6 years, as the state was rebuilding from that $1 billion cut, there had been year in, year out additions of slots in the childcare system, just like in the preschool system. That's not in the governor's budget yet. That's an area where sort of some of us who are in Sacramento sort of wonder if that's one of those wins he's leaving to the legislature, and that by the time we get to his May revision proposal or a June budget, we may see something in that arena as well. But there is a critique that was not an area that was prioritized as highly, because the subsidized childcare arena both helps that 0 to 3 community that isn't in the preschool systems, but it also supports those kids who, for whatever reason, can't access preschool systems, but might be able to access subsidized childcare. But I mean, that's a sort of within the family struggle. The pushback is about, let's just see what kind of progress we can make.
Yeah, anyone else?
And I would just say to that point, I think the immediate conversation is about where does the legislature and where does the governor arrive at the end. But I also think that he has laid out some signals that he wants to have a longer term conversation about our subsidized childcare system. So there is $10 million for a master plan to look at universal preschool, as well as ensuring that all families who are eligible for subsidized childcare will have access to it. That is a huge lift for us as a state to cover, but he wants to talk about it, and he also wants to get back to the conversations about, does it need to be the way that it is now? Can we look at it from a family-centered design? Starting, family enters the door, do they need to have the way that the current system works? Because we know so many of them right now are on waiting lists. We know that there's a lot that can be done in terms of early intervention. There's a lot more that can be done in promoting multilingualism from the earliest of ages. So he really is interested in, like, I know that we need to make investments right now, but I also want to know where as a state can we go that's going to get us, and he always goes back to the future of work. Where do we need to be as a state, you know, in the 20 years from where these little kiddos are now, where do we need to be, and then work our way back. So I take solace, I guess, but I also know that he very much wants to do immediate asks, but also get to these longer-term, thornier questions about, is what we're doing the right way to do it?
Yeah, and in my reporting, that's something that I hear a lot from parents and families, you know, kind of shaking it up and really making sure that whatever new policies are developed are informed by their actual needs and experiences, so you don't have to backtrack and rework things. A question for each of you, but I'll start with you, Kim. What is the role for philanthropy in all of this that we've talked about? What do you want people in this room to really take away?
I think the role for philanthropy in many ways is really unprecedented upside. I think, you know, to the earlier conversation that Steve was alluding to, there are lawyers on hand to help folks understand and also maybe talk to their boards about why policy engagement matters. The small and beautiful that we have done, and small is not really so small in LA, obviously, but it is small nonetheless because it is not universal. Philanthropy is fantastically important on innovation, but we are never going to be the scale and sustainability agents. We always need to be in conversation with government in order to think about bringing what is innovative and exciting and cutting edge to a larger swath of the public. And particularly, I think, as funders, thinking about how to actually enable the nonprofits who have the expertise to do this work to actually be in conversation with the governor's office, with the legislature, to share what has worked in California and what has worked in LA in particular is so vitally important. The second thing I would also lift up is, to Kris's point earlier, there is a little bit of sort of desire, I think, for all parties to claim credit for early childhood thriving, and that is a fantastic problem to have. I think that is so much a 180 from where we have been, where it was sort of a leftover, if you have time and sort of extra budget dust, maybe we can talk about little kids. It is a sea change in that respect. However, it is also not a foregone conclusion that it should continue in perpetuity in this way. And so, especially for, again, boards who may be a little less comfortable with more direct advocacy and policy engagement, communications engagement is a beautiful place of public will building, of public education, so that it's not just sort of the goodness of the governor's heart and maybe his 4-year-old being really viscerally in his life experience, but for all of our legislators to also feel the communications push to actually be their best versions of themselves and to actually think about children and families in ways that candidly they don't have to, because little kids don't vote, right? That is always sort of the trade-off of thinking about how do you make this a front burner issue. And some of that is communications campaigns. But the last thing I'll just say on that is it used to not be a public norm. I can even say, as a child who grew up in the 70s, it used to be a great thrill to ride on road trips without a seatbelt, to climb from the front seat to the back seat, and that was great fun. And I didn't think anything, and I don't think my parents thought anything about the safety of it. It is now an established public norm that it is unsafe for your child to do that, right? And we know because of crash safety tests, and we know that children internalize the norm, that parents internalize the norm, that community members do. Thinking about how we build that norm, that young children should be healthy, should be able to thrive, should be educated, and that is not just a nice to have, but is a necessity, that is work that philanthropy can do.
Well, now I want to give people in the room a chance to ask questions themselves. So if you just want to raise your hand, I think someone will be coming to you. There's people with mics, if you raise your hand.
Good morning. Parker Blackman with the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. So you can imagine I'm pretty thrilled about this conversation, and thanks for being here, and thanks to SCG for having this be the opening plenary session. To the point you were just all talking about sustainability and what philanthropy can do, one of the things that strikes me, I'd love your thoughts on, is once the budget's passed, a lot of this money flows downhill, and how the dollars get implemented is really at the local level. We're talking about school districts, county departments of public health, mental health, children and family services, and so the sustainability of it depends in part on how well those dollars get implemented at the local level. So what can philanthropy be doing as a partner with local districts and agencies to ensure that not only do dollars get implemented effectively, but then what we learn year over year gets communicated back up to the governor's office and legislative leaders so that we can be informing the change, and as we make long-term sustainable investments, we make those investments even smarter. Thank you.
Thanks, Parker. You teed it up quite nicely because that's what you do, right? Because I've already received a couple of memos from you about here's what's happening in LA County, and this is what we lessons learned, and that's exactly right. That really helps us in Sacramento understand what's going on at the local level. I mean, LA, you already know, you are a state. You really can help us learn a lot and hopefully not mess up at the state level. You all won't mess up, you'll figure it out, but you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot to be learned from what you're doing at the local level, whether it's through the expansion, ETK that was expanded at LAUSD, the stuff that's happening with the Prop 63 mental health dollars, using that for NFP, Nurse Family Partnership expansion at your Department of Health. There's lots in LA that you are teaching us right now. But to be honest, if you're doing things and we may not know about them, so please toot the horns of the folks, the grantees that you're funding. Think about, I see where the governor's trying to go. If you haven't read the Early Childhood Budget Summary, I read it once a day. Department of Finance, dof.ca.gov, Early Childhood Summary, the first one ever. It's a big deal, and that is the first issue. Look through that and say, we fund this, we fund that. I could share some lessons learned with them. A one-page memo, some bullets, just a note so that I'm like, I remember they're doing something. And I know in LA, foster care, you're doing a lot of really, really good things. So I'd love to keep learning. So thank you, Parker, for teeing that up. Yes, please share.
Do you really read it once a day?
I do read it.
Like
Maybe
with
not
coffee?
right now.
Or?
No, I just kind of rub it and say, oh my God, look at this. It's a whole new world.
Yeah, any other thoughts on that, connecting the local and to?
I also just think there's a huge role, because the budget adoption process it takes two to tango. The governor, I think, has come out strong, and we need our legislative champions to also lift this up considerably, and sometimes it actually matters, right? To have, if you have a great pilot program in a local legislator's district, you should totally be funding your grantees to go talk to their local legislature, right? It's not just sort of in the abstract that they govern for the entire state of California. They are also very much their own hometown constituency-driven folks, right? And they need to be reelected, and they listen to their constituents in a way that is more palpable if you are in their local district. And so reaching out to them and sharing your stories, but also sharing how it connects to this year's budget matters.
Next question.
Hi, good morning. Danielle Brazell, City of Los Angeles, Department of Cultural Affairs. So this is a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your incredible insight. I heard, Giamina, you say 10 million for planning. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And then I also heard that kind of recession looming. So we've got these new interesting two parallel tracks, and taking up from what Steve talked about in his opening remarks about that fascinating convening that took place in 2000 on the eve of the energy crisis in California. How do we prepare for planning and implementation in the midst of the unknown and the changing environment and landscape, knowing what we know now?
That's a great question. That's something that haunts me at 2 a.m. as well, that I'm sure many other staff people, but we have to do both. And that's why this governor has done a lot with budget resiliency, as well as made some really strong investments, is that he says one-time investments because we know things are going to get shaky. But to Kris's point, that he has also built reserves. He also has done some things that people are like, wow, what does that mean? But it means a lot in paying down our debt, so we're not doing funny math every year to push things out. So he's really trying to make a solid ground for our state, but we have to do both. And this governor is not shy on taking on all of these issues, and we know there's going to other conversations about revenue, that additional revenues that need to be part of this. But he's wrapping his arms around all of it and saying we're going to still plan, and we're going to aim for the North Stars, but we're also going to try to chug along in the smartest way as possible.
There's also a piece to this which is about diversifying our revenue streams, and also having a conversation about local revenue streams. So there is a bill going through the legislature right now, which Senator Ben Allen is the co-sponsor for, which would reduce the threshold for passing local parcel taxes from 67%, which is a sort of aftermath of Prop 13, to 55%, which is what local school bonds are required to hit today. There's a study done of the last 10 years of all the parcel taxes that have been run, and it's like 95% of them would have passed if the threshold were 55 instead of 67. That is a systems change. That does not cost the legislature anything, but it could cost us something locally. And I think I am always somewhat aghast to be in good company of Northern Cal colleagues, especially from San Francisco, because they have passed local taxes for children not once, not twice, but like 4 and 5 times in the span where the city of Los Angeles and most of our major metropolitan areas have not. There are a couple of local, Santa Monica has passed some taxes. There are smaller parcel taxes that have gone through in smaller municipalities. And candidly, it's wealthier communities funding themselves and thinking about what it means for us to actually say, we're as good as San Francisco for darn sure. And we should prioritize our kids at least as much as other more affluent communities around the state are doing. The other thing that I'll just also flag is that because our state budget is so heavily driven by the markets and the top 2% roughly of income earners who derive most of their income from the markets, we are at the whimsy of what is going on with the stock market. And so one way to actually think about diversifying our revenue streams is to think about local taxes, but also look at alternative revenue streams. And so Prop 64, marijuana taxes, had a prevention and child-focused prevention and family prevention lens when it was run as a campaign. For whatever people might think about marijuana, it is $1 billion tax revenue per year in the state of Colorado that goes to kids. That is something that we also need to actually be thinking about and having policy advocates tracking at the state level.
Just a little plug on the pot. Pot for tots is what I try to get people to buy into. It's not,
Oh dear.
I told you I'm an advocate, so I'm just going to try to push.
Just so everyone's clear on
Not for them, of course.
not for them.
Just
Pot revenue for
Yeah.
tax.
It's not as snazzy. So folks, we all had a lot of expectations about the cannabis revenue, and at least in the first couple of years, it's not going to be as robust as we thought it would be. But we are having internal conversations about the prevention piece and where do funding sources for kids line up in that.
Great. Thanks so much for your great questions. We have time for one more.
Yes, good morning. This question is primarily for Christine. And so I was delighted to hear that the governor's focus on reducing the silo approach to the issues will be a new focus. By the way, I'm Will Parrish, co-chair of the California Environmental Literacy Initiative. So I'm wondering if how the State Board of Ed will look at using the public school system to teach students about the critical interdependence of California communities, natural systems that provide the clean air and water and food in conjunction with the California communities in general. The school to CTE, the school to better jobs, to higher ed, to better communities, better health, is connected to the ed system in a way that was supported by Governor Brown signing SB 720 last September, the Environmental Literacy Education Initiative. So thank you.
So I think, actually, I haven't had my first meeting of the Board of Education yet. I actually have to get sworn in first and have a Senate confirmation hearing. But the very first agenda item that we have is on college and career readiness. And I know that the next generation science standards, which encompass, at least in part, environmental stewardship, are part of that. And so actually the State Board has one annual session, which is called the study session, and this year's study session will be focusing on that on May the 7th for the very first time. So I appreciate you lifting that up, and I'll look forward to actually seeing that in the conversation and lifting it up if not.
And I would be remiss if I didn't say, please don't start at K when you're talking about any of your issues. Please start as early as possible. STEM started in K through 12, and now we're looking at how do we promote STEM in an age and developmentally appropriate way earlier on. But I am an early childhood advocate in that sense, is that please always look at your issue areas. How are they connected to early childhood? Because they usually are.
Great. Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights, and also for your great questions.